finally, a source of raw, real, and honest information on healthcare issues that matter most. Welcome to BS Free MD. From the latest medical information to how to stay sane as a doctor or a patient, no subject is taboo, no BS is allowed. Now, let's welcome your hosts, Doctors May and Tim Hindmarsh.
Hey everybody, welcome back. Guess who I have with me this week? I'm not solo. I've got Tim. He's back from Sturgis, so you can listen to us both natter away this week as we interview our guest. He's sitting here pretty quiet right now. Got much to say?
Well, Sturgis was awesome as usual. There is a maxim in Sturgis, which are the people that are naked you don't want to see naked, and the ones that are wearing clothes that you would want to see naked you never see naked. So
sounds like the doctor's office.
It's pretty much exactly like the doctor's office in that regard. So other than that,
someone wrote a post on our Instagram about that, about the things that go on there, and I just said, oh, but the things that happen behind closed doors at the doctor's office are just as crazy as Sturgis. So
well, and you can make Sturgis what you want. I mean, what we do is pretty tame. It's largely about going to cool venues and riding motorcycles. It's not, I mean,
yeah, you're there for the bikes and the camaraderie and I don't know, some of the faux leather stuff, right? Anyway.
Yes.
Someday I'll check it out to make sure it's kosher.
Right. We may have to do a more detailed debrief in a Doc Tales with regards to sort of the medicalization stuff that we think about as far as metaphors with regards to motorcycling. And, you know, I was surprised I only got chastised once by somebody for posting a picture of not wearing a helmet while riding, which is a whole other
Yeah, I like that. Medicine and motorcycles. Maybe that'll be our next episode. But this week we have a really interesting, I don't know, I think all of our stuff's interesting, of course, but you're going to like this because kind of in keeping with the COVID conversation, we are going down the rabbit hole of vaccines in kids in general. And our guest today is Dr. Paul Thomas, who is a pediatrician from the Portland, Oregon area. And he'll get into his story, but Dr. Paul is board certified in pediatrics and addiction medicine and was up until 2021. He has a longstanding history of teaching residents, med students. He opened his own practice in Portland, Oregon, and has treated numerous families and kids over the years. He then actually came up with a little interesting research study that he did as he was treating his patients, which we'll get into, which led him on to write a book called The Vaccine-Friendly Plan, published in 2016. And he has another book called The Addiction Spectrum, A Compassionate Holistic Approach to Recovery as well. He has published in some journals, some of his findings about vaccinated versus unvaccinated children. And without spoiling the whole show, we're going to get into it right now where you can hear his side of the story.
All right. Welcome back to BS Free MD. We are super excited to have Dr. Paul Thomas with us, the author of the Vaccine-Friendly Plan. Yes, kids, we are talking about vaccines and Dr. Thomas's journey in that world, and it's going to get quite interesting, I can guarantee you. So, Dr. Paul Thomas, welcome to BS Free MD. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you, Tim and May. It's great to be on your show. I grew up in Africa. I was a child of missionaries and went to Dartmouth Medical School. And I always kid that, you know, all I learned about vaccines in medical school was the diseases for which they were made and how amazing they were. They never told us what was in them. They certainly never told us that vaccines had any side effects. It was always, to this day, safe and effective. That's what they say. So that's how I came out of training. I went to the UC California system for residency. I had 2 years in Fresno, finished my residency in San Diego. It was a really strong program, and moved to Portland, Oregon right after that in 1988. So that was when I taught residents and medical students for 5 years. I was so in debt that I couldn't see my way clear by teaching, so I went into private practice. I joined a group of 4 other pediatricians, and I was with them for 13 years. So that took us to 2007, 2008, when I ended up starting my own practice. I'll give you a little bit of information about how that happened, because that sort of explains my journey. In 2004, well, actually, let me back up a little further. You may remember 1999, I believe it was, Andy Wakefield wrote a paper in Lancet that he was a pediatric gastroenterologist at Royal Hospital in England, London. And I didn't read that paper till 2000, 2001. I just was behind on, it's hard to keep up with all the journals. And I saw that paper and it was like, he was a gastroenterologist who did biopsies on both regular inflammatory bowel disease kids and kids with autism who were having inflammatory bowel disease-like symptoms, and found something different. The autistic kids had a different process going on. And he postulated in that article that maybe it had something to do with the MMR vaccine. He didn't say it did for sure. We should look into this. Well, they crucified him for a decade, finally took his license, to the point that today, if you go to the Urban Legend Dictionary, there is a term being Wakefielded, named after Andy Wakefield, and that is where you get persecuted by the establishment for your views. And in his case, it was, suggesting that there might be a link between vaccines and harm. So when I woke up to that fact, we were starting to see autism, right? It was still somewhat rare, but as a pediatrician, I was starting to see it. And then in 2004, 5, 6, and 7, for those 4 years, each year in my own patient population, I think I had about 1,500, 2,000 patients of my own. Each year of those 4 years, I had a normal 1-year-old become severely nonverbal autistic by age 2. And it was like, what the heck is going on? And I'd been doing a deep dive into, trying to figure this out, right? And we were thinking maybe it's mercury because they had mercury in the vaccines. Maybe it's toxins. Well, we since know it's definitely toxins. It's aluminum, it's mercury, it's immune activation. It's all sorts of reasons that vaccines are part of the problem when you start looking at chronic disease. But we didn't have any good research, right? So I went into practice. My partners, I went to them actually after that 4th case in November of 2007, and I said, I can no longer ethically recommend the hepatitis B vaccine for newborns whose mothers are hepatitis B negative. And so we know that you catch hepatitis B from sex and IV drug use. This one just makes no sense. Medically, ethically, I can't do it. And they said, well, ethically, if you don't follow the CDC schedule, you're being unethical. Here's the door. So we had a parting of the ways. And that far into my career, I thought, oh my gosh, this is a disaster. Ended up being the best thing that ever happened to me, because I was able to start integrative pediatrics June of 2008, where we have the one guiding principle that if you work here, you have to honor, and that's informed consent. And that should be how all doctors practice, in my belief. It should not be, medical mandates. That's not proper medicine. We should have the process of informed consent. Vaccines are a medical procedure. So from the get-go, it was, here's the risks, here's the benefits. And one of the options has to be that you can refuse the medical procedure. And that's become problematic, as I think you two know, with medical mandates for vaccines, right? And with COVID especially. People are losing their jobs if they don't get the jab. Kids being told they can't go to school. So that's sort of the history that got me onto this journey of integrative medicine.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on the? I totally, we both totally agree on your thoughts on informed consent with patient, but I like to play devil's advocate, just like I know you do. So what is different about what you give to patients for the informed consent on the vaccine versus, what everybody else is going to say. Well, yeah, I take my child in there and they give me the sheets that are the colored sheets that have, here's your vaccine information consent form, here's the risks and benefits. So for those people that don't know the difference of what information you're providing and what is the handout from the state, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, you know how to ask the right question. So it's a journey, right? I did not come out of medical school knowing what I know today. And so early on in my career, I did exactly what you're talking about. Here's the VIS, which is the vaccine information sheet. It's made by the CDC, and it minimizes possible side effects and it maximizes benefits. And it's basically a marketing tool for the pharmaceutical industry, but the CDC does that on their behalf. That's another whole big story. That is not, in my opinion, informed consent. That is manipulation, honestly, because you are not giving the actual risks. Here's the problem, though, and you guys know this, you're in medicine. Most of us don't know what the risks are. They have not done, up until fairly recently, good studies where you have a true control group, so an unvaxxed group, and then they don't even look at the full schedule. They just, when they approve a vaccine, they look at just that vaccine. I mean, they just did the same shenanigans with the COVID jabs, where they play other tricks too. The relative risk versus the absolute risk, and they do this all the time with vaccines. So that with the COVID, as use that one as an example, and Pfizer, I mean, the absolute risk reduction is like 1% or less, but they were able to claim this, 95% relative risk reduction. It's just a charade. So the way you get to absolute risks is you start to look for, there's plenty of literature out there. Neil Miller published a book on vaccines that has like 400 peer-reviewed articles that at least would highlight that there are some issues with vaccines that aren't being addressed in those VIS handouts. Here's my dilemma. As a pediatrician who saw 4 of his own patients regress into autism, and in one case, there was no question, it was the vaccine and they regressed right away. And I was getting patients coming into my practice because they were being discharged from other practices. Pretty much almost on a weekly basis, I would have a new patient join my practice and they would tell me the same story. Their kid was doing great. They got the MMR or they got a series of vaccines. Sometimes it's the 18-month jabs, and they watched their kid regress. Sometimes immediately, sometimes it was just over a period of 6 months to a year. Hard to really know if it was the vaccines. That's part of the problem because, again, we didn't have those studies. So after some years at Integrated Pediatrics, I started seeing, I'm getting more and more families who aren't vaccinating, and I'm starting to notice their unvaxxed kids are just healthy. It was palpable. So I got an IRB, Institutional Review Board, approval to look at my data retrospectively. So it wasn't a study, it was just a data analysis. And I had, Liz Mumford had published a study with a couple hundred patients showing that her unvaxxed patients weren't getting autism compared to her vaxxed patients. And I thought, well, I've got a bigger population than that. Why don't I just look at my data and copy her study, which I pretty much just did that. I couldn't get it published. The same journal that accepted her study wouldn't even respond to me. And this is one of the problems, is getting this sort of data published is really, really difficult. And I'm more of a clinician than a researcher, so that it wasn't really in my wheelhouse. So I thought, okay, I'm just going to write a book then. I mean, you can't stop me from sharing the data in a book. So that's when I wrote the vaccine-friendly plan with my co-author, Jennifer Margulis. And I wrote most of the content. She just fixed it up and made it look great and got solid references and did peer review analysis to make sure all our references were spot on. Got it published by a major publisher. That was 2016. And so I digressed a little bit, but to answer your question, my information gets better and better as we go on through the years. Like now, and this is why the board doesn't want me talking about vaccines, I cannot tell patients what I'm telling you here because it is against my stipulated agreement. So we'll
right.
get to that.
So basically, to the first point was that initially when you started your own practice and you wanted to provide informed consent, it was based on sort of what you were seeing, the literature you had researched, and you typed that up, shared that with your patients in a way. It's like, okay, this is what I've found, what some of the research has found, pros and cons, and you can decide from there. And that's obviously evolved based on now your retrospective analysis of your own patient population, which I'd love to get into.
Well, yeah. One other thing comes to mind, which I've always been freaking out about. I mean, I think I always said that I wanted to start a subspecialty called anti-bullshitology because, just common sense is better than any randomized controlled trial. And I remember I taught medical students and then residents for, decades. And I'd say, look at this patient's medication list, and they're on 12 or 13 different meds. And I said, what we're doing to this patient is unknowable. You can say that there's a study that statin is going to reduce their second heart attack risk by X, Y, or Z. And you can say that the lisinopril and the Lasix that they're on is going to change their blood pressure by, whatever number. But you cannot tell me what all of these medications in combination do. It is unknowable. It is unstudyable.
Yeah, I mean,
but that's not how. But
like
that's the practice of medicine, and not this sciencey thing, right? So and it's important, I think, for the listeners to understand there's a complete disconnect from the getting a molecule, producing a drug, studying it, getting approval, and then what it actually looks like in real life. Because, it's kind of like you can study to the molecular level rubber compounds, but that doesn't mean how the tire is going to work when it's actually on a certain vehicle. And we're the guys that are the mechanics that have to go, no, I wouldn't get those tires. Not because I didn't read the study that says it's the greatest rubber in the world. It's because every single time somebody comes in, they explode and kill people. So maybe you shouldn't get the exploding and killing people tires.
Yeah.
And that's our job.
Yeah, no, and you're absolutely right. And so as a pediatrician, and you both are a family practice, so you've seen what I've seen. As that schedule expanded and we added more and more vaccines to the schedule, I started noticing our kids aren't doing very well. Kids are supposed to just be healthy. I grew up in Africa as a kid, just running around, in the woods almost, so to speak. I know they had a vaccine campaign that came through the village I was living in because I've got a couple scars to prove it. One was probably smallpox and the other was TB and polio, maybe. I don't know, BCG and polio. But what's been happening with kids' health is just horrendous. And of course, adding the COVID jab is going to make things even worse. But what we've needed were studies that compared unvaxxed to vaxxed so that you could have an actual true control group. And those have started coming out. So to go back to answer your question, if I could provide proper informed consent today, I would share that data. And when you share that data, so it starts with Mawson did a survey study and found that there was 4 times as much ADD, ADHD, neurodevelopmental issues in the vaccinated compared to the unvaccinated. 30 times as much allergic rhinitis. So neurodevelopment and allergies seem to be big in the highly vaccinated compared to the unvaxxed. Then you've got Hooker and Miller have come out with a couple studies in the last 2-3 years. You've got my study, the relative incidence of office visits and cumulative rates of bill diagnoses along the axis of vaccination. Long title, but basically we wanted to actually look at all billed diagnoses. So this is something anybody could do in their practice if they had a big enough practice, and just compare unvaxxed to more vaxxed or relatively vaxxed or fully vaxxed. And what we found was huge increases compared to the unvaxxed. The vaccinated had more asthma, more allergic rhinitis, more behavioral issues, more ADD, ADHD, more respiratory infections, ear infections, eye infections. Doesn't matter what kind of infection we looked at. And then all the allergies, eczema, that stuff exploding in the vaccinated compared to the unvaxxed. So if I'm going to give you true informed consent, this was real world data in my practice. It matched what I saw. So now I've got the clinical knowledge, I've got the clinical experience, now I've got the data to back it up in an IRB approved study. The funny story of this particular study is in January of 2019, the Oregon Medical Board sent me a letter, prove that your vaccine-friendly plan is as safe as the CDC schedule. I opened that letter and I thought, this is crazy. The CDC's never proven that what they're doing is safer than nothing. They also, you guys know this, every year they meet, ACIP, and they come out with a new recommendation for the year. And they just add, they never subtract. So I've watched over the last 35 years, they just keep adding, and compressing more and more vaccines on the younger infant schedule. Well, what has it done for the health of our kids? Well, it's been a disaster. And so this kind of real world data that I presented finally kind of was, bam, this is so powerful. And what was their response? 5 days after that was published online, they took my license. They had an emergency meeting. It was a Thursday afternoon. My attorney called me the next day on Friday, says, Paul, you can't go into the office. You can't see patients. Don't call patients. Don't write any prescriptions. Your license has been emergently suspended. You are a threat to public health. Well, I had a lot of addiction patients who are on Suboxone, buprenorphine. I use a technique for addiction to opiates of slowly weaning the dose while very carefully monitoring these. These were young adults. I don't think they need harm reduction and be placed on high dose, whether it's buprenorphine or methadone, for the rest of their lives. That just didn't make sense for a 20-year-old. So I was having great success at getting these kids weaned down and then a lot of them off of opiates. And they were like, boom, I had to abandon them. I had a colleague just call them all and give them some ideas of places they could go, but I was not allowed to write prescriptions. And then for my practice, thankfully, I have nurse practitioners who really know what they're doing, very competent. I have one other MD who's in semi-retirement who was able to also, kick in for supervision when there was a need. And we were able to keep our practice going. But yeah, it was an interesting time. Several months into that, a friend of mine says, I don't think what they did was legal. Why don't you ask your attorney? And my attorney goes, oh, you know what? They emergently suspended your license. They never filed charges. So I was able to get it back. I had to have a stipulated agreement. My attorney was in negotiations with the medical board, and they would not let up on these 3 points. So I ended up agreeing to it to save my practice. And that is, I can't do well child care. I can't talk about vaccines, nor instruct my staff about vaccines. And I'm only supposed to do acute care and no research. Interesting that the board would not want research done. That tells you what they're worried about.
Well, so I have worked with one physician in my 30 years that lost his license. I mean, this is all public, you can look it up. So it's nothing secret. And he went before the board, I don't know how many times. I think it was at least 3 or 4 times for overt sexual harassment of nursing staff. I mean, it was, and it was all written out in the board complaint, like stuff like he'd come up to a nurse and go, wow, you look really great today, but you'd look better naked. Okay. Whoa. Well, and he didn't lose his license for that. He lost his license for ignoring the stipulated orders and continuing with behavior like that and much worse for about 3 years.
Yeah. No, it used to be you would lose your license if you were intoxicated on the job, right? Or you were sexually harassing your patients, or usually patients, but you have a different situation. That's what the board was supposed to do, is take predators and really wackadoo docs out of the system. But now they seem to just be an agent of status quo. And it's really harmful to medicine, because when you have new information that's showing we need to change our paradigm, you can't do that when the medical board is going to put a squash to that.
Well, and it would be one thing if they had shown that what you were doing with your study was actually overtly harming kids, but it wasn't. They were seeing you less. They weren't seeing you more.
Way less. I'm thinking the first thing that actually, when you described what happened, was my thought was, so if a physician abandons his patients, quits, I mean, you have to provide some kind of backup plan. Yet it didn't sound like that the board was like, okay, we're pulling your license immediately. You can't practice. And oh, by the way, then we send in this team to coordinate a backup plan for your patients, especially the ones on the Suboxone. It was just like, whatever happens to them, let them take responsibility for figuring out someone to take care of them in a situation like this. Like that boggles my mind.
I agree.
For one thing,
that one,
I mean, they're responsible for patient abandonment, but like to Tim's point, so what you're doing is actually research. It's like here's what we're seeing, presenting that. Yet how many times, I'm sure you've seen it as well, and I get frosty about some people that aren't medical doctors but claim to be experts in healing kids' ear infections by spine manipulation, or they're going to cure their diabetes by this magic potion or massage or etc. And I'm not saying that there isn't a place maybe for some of that to help drain fluid, but there's all these wacky things out there that happens in the name of science that to me sometimes looks like it could do more harm to the patient. And that just, I don't know, they have different boards or they turn a blind eye. Yet this is just so, to me, blatantly obvious that they're trying to suppress or hide something.
Well, yeah, clearly.
Yeah.
I guess the question I always have with regards to vaccination is, and my personal views have changed a bit, but, two things can be true at the same time. And we have, to be good at science, we have to accept that. So the COVID vaccines are clearly garbage. Like when you look at this, I think there's very good evidence that they're negatively effective at this point. When you look at the UK and Israel and so forth, there, even Fauci has come out and said that they don't stop transmission. Deborah Birx said that she always knew that they didn't stop transmission, which means if that's the case, then she was lying to the country and to the, to Trump's COVID coordination team, et cetera, which is damnable in my opinion. But at the same time, measles has an R naught of, 15 to 18. So it's super, super duper contagious. It has an animal reservoir, so it's going to come back. And so what about the people that say, and I tend to believe this in a large degree, that the vaccines have been kind of at least the initial pediatric vaccines have been they've been a victim of their own success. They've worked so well that we don't have any archetypical memory. Like nobody alive that is a parent now remembers what diphtheria was like, or remembers what a measles epidemic was like, or even mumps. I mean, I had mumps. I have pictures of myself when I was 2 years old with mumps. And, and those, measles kills basically almost nobody. Mumps, there's infertility. Rubella is an issue, especially in pregnancy and so forth. Diphtheria, I've seen one case and that child died, and that was in Kathmandu. And so, the vaccines clearly do something, and maybe they did it so well that we don't see these other diseases. So all we see is the side effects of the vaccines, and there's clearly side effects. It's a medical treatment. Every medical treatment has a downside, not just an upside. So now what we see is this huge increase in just the downside of the vaccines. So where am I right or where am I wrong?
So you picked a great example of the MMR. So measles has a mortality rate. If you are malnourished and low in vitamin A, that mortality rate can be as high as 1 in 1,000. If you have adequate vitamin A and you're well nourished, you're, a healthy immune system kid is probably going to survive it just fine. Maybe the mortality rate's 1 in 10,000, 1 in 100,000, something like that, but it's not zero. So you have that philosophy that all lives are valuable. We don't want to lose any life to a vaccine preventable disease. And that's sort of the charge and the mantra of the vaccine industry. Well, if they were truly as safe as they say they are, in other words, it's 1 in a million kid that gets harmed. If that was true, then they're right. We should vaccinate away. It's a great program. With regards to measles, we know there's a mortality attached to it. With regards to congenital rubella, I've taken care of a congenital rubella kid when I was in training. It was horrendous. But those events, if you're going to give true informed consent, you've got to look at risks and benefits, not just benefits. The risks, unfortunately, have not been adequately addressed, and you only can really compare apples to apples when you have a true control group. So this is the charge for us today. Yeah, we can look historically at what the risks of those diseases were. I don't think we have much risk of diphtheria coming back. I mean, measles, yes, it would come back to some extent. I agree with you. But if there really is a risk, and I don't know actually, because we're in a different world. Vaccinating today in 2022 is so different from when I was growing up as a kid in the 50s and 60s, in a very pristine world, eating vegetables out of my garden, compared to, our bodies are loaded with glyphosate and all sorts of other endocrine disruptors and pesticides, herbicides. You add vaccines to the current body, and we would have to just start over on research, right? I mean, the science is never settled. There's the problem. So let's get more data, not less. We have control groups living in every huge data system. Kaiser could look. They have unvaccinated people in Kaiser, probably tens of thousands of them, if not more. They just need to age match them, socioeconomically match them. Look at the data. Why don't they do that?
What? Yeah, that's exactly what I know. I'm thinking, and listeners, it's like, why don't they do that? Well, I mean, that's the question.
I can come up with an answer, and it might be good, but it's an answer, and it's not just sinister. I mean, I think that there's a lot of sinister stuff that goes on, and if you listen to our other podcasts, we talk about that extensively. But I could intuit why unvaccinated children would be significantly more healthy, because they're still getting benefits of other children being vaccinated. Okay. So you have this herd, you're swimming, you have a child with a perfectly intact innate immune system. And I didn't know what an innate immune system was until about a year ago when Gert Vandenbosch explained it to me in one of his papers. I wouldn't have known what innate immunity was if it, would have clubbed me on the skull. So I'll be honest with my ignorance. So innate immunity is very powerful. Children are born with incredibly powerful innate immunity because they have to be, or else they'd all be dead. Because anytime they get in, a cold or anything like this, they have this very broad spectrum immunity that helps solve that problem because they don't have specific immunity yet. Okay. Which makes sense. But now you have these kids with the benefit of not having an immunological challenge, having strong innate immunity, and they're swimming in a pool of vaccinated herd immune people. So they don't get these diseases that they would have been vaccinated for because everyone else is immune to them. And they get the benefit of a robust innate immune system and a non-screwed up, whatever. So there's my inarticulate question.
So I have a comment to that. So what we've learned from COVID is that the unvaccinated kids who have that robust innate immune system are the protective shield for the rest of us, because they will develop natural immunity, and natural immunity is much more robust. So here's the thing, Tim, that's true for the other diseases as well. And in fact, it is our vaccinated kids, and my data shows this, who are getting sick all the time. They're getting all the infections. They're spreading these infections to all their other vaccinated and unvaccinated. So the doctrine that we've been raised with, that, it's these vaccinated who are providing this shield, I would question that. I don't think that's actually what's going on.
I think to Tim's point, I think that was the thinking, right? Or the thought initially to roll these out. It's like, well, we'll get the majority vaccinated to protect the population. But we're finding.
But we're seeing that with COVID too.
Yeah.
Which is, but again, right? It's two things can be true at the same time. The herd immune kids, clearly we have herd immunity to measles, or else we'd have massive measles outbreaks because it's so darn contagious and there's an animal reservoir.
Yeah,
so measles
you're absolutely right, Tim. Measles is a great example of vaccine success as far as creating enough herd immunity. I mean, I got titers. I've been doing titers for 20 years. And here's why. So the board is actually on after me on this. They think I'm experimenting. No, it's a clinical decision-making tool. So after kids get their 12 to 15 month MMR, what percentage are actually immune? Well, the data says 95%. That's actually true because I get titers when they're 4, 5, 6 to determine whether or not they need that second booster. And guess what? 95% of the time they don't need it. But I found out another interesting point. Patients who waited till age 3 to get the MMR, 98 to 99% of the time they have lasting immunity. So it's even higher. So giving the MMR at 12 to 15 months, timing-wise, may not be optimal. But I understand the thinking behind it. You want to catch and protect as early as possible so that you're protecting the most people. I get it. I think that there's no question the measles program has been a real success as far as creating a population that's immune. And we haven't had too much downside from it. I mean, there are some articles that getting natural measles is protective against cancer, but overall, I agree. That is a vaccine that worked well. We've got a lot that are not, there's no benefit to the Hep B for newborns whose mothers do not have Hep B.
Yeah, I'm kicking myself over that one.
I remember, so with our kids who are now in their early 20s, when all this started rolling out, and thinking, we were all along, we were part of the program and kind of bought into all the, trusted the science, trusted the authorities. But
I did too.
I remember thinking, oh, this seems odd. Like, well, what are their risks for this? I mean, I guess, maybe little Hindmarsh is going to go be a health food worker, and we're protecting him now. I mean, it was kind of stupid thinking. And then,
well, I know those 6-month-olds get tattoos like you can't believe.
Then holding them down, and then actually, I got to. This is a secret that some people know, that I got to play Tim's nurse for 1 year in between some of my gigs I did. And so I literally was giving all the vaccines in his practice for this year, and thinking, not just our kids, but does this make sense? We're giving all of this at one time. And they were adding more and more to this. And this was in the 90s. And I'm thinking, how can this be good? Like, I know that an antibiotic against a targeted illness is good. And super sick people that need double antibiotic coverage in the ICU at the time, PIP and Tober and all those things, vancomycin. Well, those are bad when you give these heavy duty things together. But 3, 4, I'm thinking antibiotics and once that just destroys your gut. We knew that a long time ago. And I'm thinking, what the heck are all these antibiotics? Or what their body going to do when they get all of this load at one time, and their immune system doesn't know what's up? Heaven forbid they catch something. So, and now the things added, there's even more.
The one where I pumped the brakes was varicella. I'm like, why in the name of common sense are we immunizing kids for chickenpox? I mean, when I was a kid, in the early 70s, we had chickenpox parties, for the love of God. It's like, oh, Billy's got the chickenpox. Go over there and lick his face.
Oh, we did.
And it was like, and I got in an argument with a retired physician who's like 70 years old. Okay, so he remembers getting chickenpox and chickenpox parties and all this. And I said, why in the name of common sense would you vaccinate for varicella? Well, because it kills people. And I'm like, what? And so you remember the stream of funerals in 1965 for all of the neighborhood kids that got chickenpox and died? It's like, no, they had chickenpox parties. Well, it can kill you. And I'm like, well, lots of things can kill you. Like underinflated tires can kill you. So, I mean, there's a point where it just became ridiculous. And I was just like, and then, I didn't know the background details as far as Gardasil, but I would tell patients, I'd say, this is a lifestyle vaccine. And I can't tell you any different than that. It's you don't get this disease because someone sneezed on you. You get it from being promiscuous. So you guys decide what you want.
So the varicella campaign was done to save money. There were articles published. It was blatantly just, this is going to be cost effective. Parents don't have to miss so much work. That's how they rolled it out. There were 50 deaths per year right before that vaccine was brought to market in the entire country, 50 deaths per year from varicella. After vaccination was mainstreamed, the death rate went up to over 100, but they were mosely from zoster. So older people with impaired immune systems dying from a reactivation of the virus. So that program has been overall a failure. Honestly, I totally agree with you. And there would be no harm in stopping it. Yeah, kids will go back to getting chickenpox eventually, and so what? That would be an example of, maybe we ought to just really look at what we've done and make some common sense decisions. Gardasil, you bring up my least favorite vaccine up until COVID. Now COVID takes the prize. People who've looked at OpenVAERS data, I'm sure you guys have seen it. We have exceeded mortality from COVID vaccines compared to the last 30 years, all vaccines combined. But Gardasil, there's articles on ovarian failure. There's information out there that, this might have been part of the plan. We certainly have some information to make it suspicious that the COVID vaccine is specifically targeting fertility. The spike protein does concentrate in the gonads. And so I'm starting already to have some late teens patients who aren't having their periods. And it's like, did they get the COVID vaccine? Oh, they did. I don't know. We don't have enough data, but that's the thing. We don't have enough data. So folks.
No, and that's exactly right. Like I saw something, I didn't pay for the subscription. So I got hit at the paywall, but on the Epic Times that Fauci actually came out and admitted that, you can get menstrual irregularities from the vaccine. And I'm just like, okay, I mean,
and not even post, I'm hearing postmenopausal women starting to bleed again. My biggest fear, all my friends and I, not just, jokingly, but it is frightening. Sorry, Tim, what were you going to say?
No, I'm just saying, how do you keep your job when you've had so many obvious contradictions? Like where, you say, I had no power to shut down the government. I never said that we should shut down the government. And then they Daily Wire or Daily whoever it was that had that meme, and then they spin it back to 2020, and he goes, I recommended to the presidential task force that we shut down the country. And I'm like how he is absolutely Teflon Tony, as what RFK Jr. calls him. Like it's just staggeringly unbelievable to me. Like people obviously have no memory. He's had more positions on what we should do with COVID than the Kama Sutra, and somehow he manages to keep his job and get promoted.
My understanding is he hasn't taken care of a single COVID patient. So, it's doctors like you two who've been frontline urgent care, seeing all the sickest COVID patients and managing them very well, I understand.
Well, I had a couple of questions I was thinking of, but since we're on topic with the NIAID, National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Disease, correct?
It's interesting how those two things go together.
Which Dr. Fauci is the appointed head of. And what I've been reading lately and finding out, which blows my mind but makes sense with what we're talking about with the vaccine schedule, is that over the last, 50, even less years, the number of asthma and allergy and infectious disease, eczema, all these things has skyrocketed. I think isn't it increased by 50% or more in children compared to in the 50s and 60s. Like eczema almost didn't exist at all, and now it's super common.
%. Yeah.
And you'd think that with that institute is responsible for researching this, there would be welcome research into causes, looking at vaccine schedule or what's going on in the environment or antibiotics, whatever it would be. Any thoughts on that?
Well, they know. So the vaxxed unvaxxed studies, Mawson's, Miller and Hooker's, mine, the controlgroup.org, all of those great studies. And I say great just because they've been done. We need better studies. We need bigger studies. We need more studies. But they're all showing the same thing. The vaccines are a huge part of the problem. And the CDC, and I think the NIH is behind them on this, and Fauci's enmeshed in all of that. Their mission and their goal is to preserve the vaccine program. It's not about health. It's about the program. And so that's a big problem. It is their whole goal is to preserve the program, not to look at the health of the population.
What's the motivation to preserve the program? Because, I've had this discussion with lots of people, and I said, look, there's lots of vaccines that we don't give to everybody. We don't give the Zostrix to little kids. We don't immunize everybody against meningitis. That's a specific vaccine. You don't get a yellow fever vaccine unless you're going to a yellow fever endemic area, right? I mean, cholera kills tons of people. We don't have a cholera vaccine. I mean, there's lots of stuff like this, right? And so, why preserve the program if the program has outlived its utility, or if it just needs to be adjusted? I mean, we're probably going to give measles vaccines to kids forever, regardless. We may not give varicella. There's lots of ways around this that may increase children's health and be better. And if it doesn't work, we go back to what we did before. I get that. But the risk doesn't seem that great to start modifying things. So why no modification?
Yeah, it's clearly conflicts of interest and money. I mean, Bob Sears wrote his book, the vaccine book, that came out in 2008, right when I opened my practice. I was about to write that exact book almost, because that's what I was experiencing. But I'm glad I waited, because I sort of created a similar but different approach of less vaccines in the vaccine-friendly plan. It was clearly safer, but then, lo and behold, doing nothing was even safer than my plan, way safer. So where do we go from here? Let's just wake up to the reality of what we've done, because we are harming children in ways that are unimaginable. I mean, if I could fast forward 50, 100 years, and we've actually looked and compared vaxxed to unvaxxed, and we've realized we don't need the chickenpox, we don't need Hep B in newborns, give it to teenagers if they're high risk and they want it. We don't need, there's a lot of the vaccines that are on the schedule, the one size fits all schedule, that is not necessary. Is there a person for whom the CDC schedule would be ideal? Yeah, maybe there's a handful in the country. Their mom's got hepatitis B, it's active, so they need the Hep B right at birth. They are living in a community that has an ongoing outbreak of all the things that are in those shots, right? You say, okay, there's a situation that calls for that. But for 99.9% of kids, the schedule is a health-destroying proposition.
How many patients in your practice chose to even just do, what would you say, spread them out, just do time versus sort of cutting one out? Is there very many patients in your practice that said, okay, let me, instead of just giving the whole schedule, the timing, all of them at once, let me give my child a couple now, wait a couple months and see what happens? Is that very common, or?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when I got that data set for my book in 2015, I'd been open since 2008, and I had 213, that's all, 213 who were unvaccinated. Most of the rest were variably vaccinated. Very few were doing the CDC schedule. Fast forward to my more recent paper, and we were up to just under 600 unvaccinated, completely unvaccinated, out of 3,500 patients. So 2,700 variably vaccinated. I don't think there was a single one, maybe one or two of those 2,700 who were following the CDC schedule. In other words, when you come to integrative pediatrics and you're given informed consent at that 2-month visit, for example, if you happen to have gotten the hepatitis B in the hospital, once you understand, like, oh, mom is immune, she was tested, there's no Hep B in the family, 99% of the patients will not get the hepatitis B vaccine. So right off the bat, I have almost no fully vaccinated patients, because they're honoring, once informed, properly informed, they don't choose to do the Hep B. Now, a lot of them will do many of the others, but on a slower schedule. And it's all different. It's not one size fits all. It's a very lengthy discussion at every well visit to go, well, here's what the CDC says you're missing. Have you given this some thought? And sometimes they have. No, we don't want any vaccines, and we honor it. Or what should we do? And we go through the pros and cons of each one.
There's another profit motive that just came to me. I've always, having seen, cradle to grave medicine, well checks always drove me nuts, because I'm like, most of what we're doing is completely worthless. Like I've diagnosed a few kids with, various anomalies or rare diseases or CP that was very mild that you couldn't diagnose at birth. And the parents figured it out way before I did. Like that 10 minutes or 15 minutes with them, 2, 4, and 6 months did virtually nothing. I mean, their weight checks, which you could do with a public health nurse in their home. And it always bugged me. But because in Canada, vaccines are not done at the doctor's office. They're done by the school system. So they're done by public health, and they will drive to your house with needles if you're not vaccinating your kid. And so I said, well, and then you look at a pediatric practice and you go, wow, like, what, 2/3, a half are well child check visits. And then you have sick kids that you pile in. And I go, if you didn't have these vaccines scheduled this way, you're losing a lot of office potential, and your kids aren't getting sick. You're losing a lot of revenue in office visits because kids don't get sick that often, and they don't need to be seen, and they really don't need to be seen routinely if you know that they're, on the growth chart by 6 months.
And you published a paper sort of to that effect.
Yeah,
I saw, correct? You want to sort of give our listeners a little overview of that?
Sure. So I was curious because, I'm the owner of my practice, and I'm noticing year after year, my bottom line is getting worse and worse, and it's correlating with people choosing to vaccinate less and less. So what was happening in Portland, Oregon area was most practices were kicking people out of their practice if they didn't follow the CDC schedule. Well, those people would end up in my practice because I'm the only full service, mainstream clinic that will allow people not to vaccinate if that's what they want. And my bottom line was looking worse and worse. Not giving vaccines is not a good business decision. You make a fortune, but I was wondering how much. So what I did was I took the month of mid-August to mid-September, and we took every single super bill. And on the back of the super bill, all my super bills, I have all the vaccines that could be given. And my staff know to every well visit, check off what they're missing according to the CDC schedule. And the parents either accept or refuse one by one by one. We do this every time. And it's part of our informed consent process. So it's very easy to go through and say, okay, here's what we made on vaccines that were taken. Here's what we lost on vaccines that they should have taken if they were following the CDC schedule. We lost over $1 million just in the admin fee. We're not talking about the well child money that you would have gotten for the visit. We're not talking about the markup that isn't much, but vaccines will have a tiny markup. Just the administration fee. We lost over $1 million. I only bill less than $3 million. So when you lose a third, no wonder we couldn't make ends meet. I mean, you guys know in medical practice, the overhead runs in pediatrics at 70%, 70, 80%.
Wow. That's incredible.
It absolutely affects people's bottom line, and pediatricians would be out of business if they weren't vaccinating.
Wow. Okay,
wow.
well,
on that light note.
So I know that we're going to get a ton of comments and questions on this episode because we already do about what are our thoughts, with COVID, should we be vaccinating for anything now? And we've had another colleague that we've done an interview with who's brought this up. So it's going to raise people's awareness and thought on should any vaccine, especially with what's happened with COVID and the big push for vaccine in kids and all the things happening. So where can people find your information? I know you have a website and YouTube channel and book. Why don't you share that for our listeners?
Oh, thank you. First of all, let me just clarify for your listeners. I am not anti-vaccine, although that's how I'm always labeled. I am pro-informed consent, and I'm all for parents making their own decisions about vaccines. If we had a safe, truly safe, and effective vaccine against a dangerous illness, we would line up. We all would. So just make a better widget, and we'll all line up for it. But people, if you want to go, it's interesting. You guys started your podcast, which I love the name of it, in January of COVID, right? 2020?
Yeah.
2021.
2021. February of 2021, I had just lost my license. I had all this time on my hands, and I started my show, Against the Wind, Doctors and Science Under Fire. So that's a good place to go for more information. It's doctors spelt out and the word AND science.com. And if you go there, you'll get access to my show. You'll get access. I've got a fundraiser. It's drpaulsfight.com. I'm raising money to fight the medical board and to sue them, actually, because that's a whole different set of attorneys. What they have done is more damaging, I think, than people realize it, because they are stipulating that I cannot do research. I am single-handedly probably sitting on the largest group of unvaccinated kids in the country. And I'm a mainstream office that vaccinates every day. I'm not anti-vaccine. We vaccinate.
Right.
That data needs to be seen, and we need more data like that, and they are preventing me from doing that. So if you can donate to our work, that would be great. drpaulsfight.com. Go to doctorsandscience.com for the show and links to everything else that I'm doing. And thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah, this has been really great. I honestly, I didn't know what to expect. We met through a common connection with Sophia Karstens, who, we were just floored that her and Tony Lyons gave us so much time to talk about RFK's book. And this has just been really great. To be honest, Paul, I was really surprised because I did not know what we were going to get. I knew I wanted to challenge sort of some of the popular argument or whatever, because we get into this binary world.
Well, people think don't vaccinate, and they see Jenny McCarthy's head screaming.
Yeah. And then my head explodes because we forget that two things can be true at the same time. And so you hear, oh, well, here's a pediatrician who's a mainstream guy who's got, Ivy League training, et cetera. And he doesn't, toe the CDC line. Well, it doesn't mean you're anti-vaccine. I mean, some vaccines can be really good. Some can be, neutral, and some can be harmful. That's the way everything in medicine is. So we just, like our friend Sabine Hazen says, let doctors be doctors. Like, we need to be practicing not just the science, but the science and the art of medicine. That means we take every single patient in consideration and the families.
And share. And, my point always is, so if somebody's wrong, let them share their point of view. Like this, what you have out there is like gold. I mean, I know clinicians, doctors, researchers, everyone would love to see this data and hear it, but you're being silenced, not allowed to share. I mean, this is kind of the new narrative of medicine, and it really is disgruntling, and why I want to pull the plug on and go become a bartender at the golf course, sadly. But we need to allow people to be able to put this information out there, let it be challenged by the experts to say, no, it's a good study or not, or this is important, or we need to do more. I mean, and like you said, what not better place than your practice?
But you know what? So neither of the three of us are 100% correct, but we're at least asking the questions, which is the foundation of science.
Yes.
And when you hear, anyone questioning me is questioning the science, because I am the science, the truth, and the light. That just it just makes me throw up out of my nose when I hear that kind of stuff, because it's so counter to what actually works.
Right. The science is never settled, and our environment, the pressures of our environment on our system are always increasing. So we have to always relook at what we're doing. Does it still make sense?
I'm going to throw out a question bomb. Have you ever thought of moving to another state to do pediatrics and see how things would go there, so you can continue doing what you were doing?
Well, I have a lot of kids and they all live in Oregon. So that would be hard right there. My patients are right here in Oregon. I don't like the politics of this state anymore, even though I was a liberal Democrat my whole life. They've sold out to pharma. I cannot support them. So I don't like talking politics, but no, I've thought of moving, but I'm not going to do it. I'm here to fight this fight, at least for the foreseeable future. We need to stand our ground. This is a beautiful state, and you know what? The truth will win in the end. I really believe it will.
I love it. No, I mean, that's exactly what we need. Is we need people to stand their ground, fight where they're at. And, that's what I always say. And
we'll send you donations from Florida.
And we're thinking of moving, so we'll send you donations from Florida. There you go. I'm being honest.
No, it's interesting. It's interesting that people that really feel like they're called to stay and people that feel like they're called to go. I mean, it's a different. We've been in this rural environment, slugging away, feeling like we were in a North American mission field for a long time, and now we feel like we need to do something else. So it's all good. I love it.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again for being here. I'll share all that information on our show notes, and people are going to love this episode. Thank you again for taking the time to be here with us. It was amazing.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Okay. That was totally different than I expected.
What did you expect?
I honestly, there's so much anger and craziness in this, even if you just talk about the COVID vaccine, like it just gets so ridiculously crazy, and how pissed off people get, and how you start quoting studies and then they can't quote a study back. And then it's just like, you're the problem. And I sit there and I go, no, I'm not the problem. And I kind of expected that this was going to be maybe more adversarial, and it wasn't. It was really amazing. I mean, Paul, honestly, is like the sweetest guy you're ever going to spend a couple hours with. And it was incredibly enlightening. And again, it was all based on, being a doctor, seeing patients, making a hypothesis, testing the hypothesis, counseling patients, being as honest as you can. And if that, that to me that's medicine. And I guess the biggest disappointment in his story to me is not that people disagree with him. And, you can agree or disagree and do your own research and all of those things. I think that that's perfectly acceptable, obviously. Is that the second he wrote the book that said maybe the CDC vaccination schedule isn't what we should be doing with our kids, that then his license is immediately pulled. And the issue for me is that you can't question. Like, he's not saying vaccines are bad. He's saying that maybe we need to question how we're doing it, because we've been doing it like this for 50 or 60 years. And that act of questioning is the most pro-science thing you can do. And the censorship of questioning is the most anti-science thing you can do. And that just completely blows my mind. I mean, the state of Oregon licenses naturopaths, and that's fine. I have nothing against naturopaths. I've seen one several times. He's very good. We have an excellent conversation. I think he's a tremendous practitioner. But there's some stuff that goes on in naturopath classes or visits that is insane. I mean, homeopathy, there is zero scientific data that homeopathy does anything. These guys don't get their license taken away for something that has zero data. And Paul was just saying, look, we need to question what's going on with vaccines, because something's going on that we can't explain, and the vaccines may be an explanation. And then these boards come in where he's clearly not damaging children. He's not damaging children. His unvaccinated kids aren't showing up in the hospital with horrible diseases because of something he's done, and they take his license away. Yet in the state of Oregon, without parental consent, a 15-year-old can go to a gender clinic and off-label get cross-sex hormones, which is dangerous.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I'm going to interject and just say, this reminds me of this quote that I love, which is that I've read recently and stuck in my brain. And without getting it wrong, it is, the work of science has nothing to do the work of science has nothing whatever to do with consensus. Consensus is the business of politics. Science, on the contrary, requires only one investigator who happens to be right, which means that he or she has results that are verifiable by reference to the real world. In science, consensus is irrelevant. What is relevant is its reproducible results.
Right.
So, and here to you, there is no such thing as consensus science. If it's consensus, it isn't science. If it's
politics.
Science, it isn't consensus, period.
No, that's exactly right.
And that is from Michael Crichton.
Yeah. And Michael Crichton, who was a absolutely avowed liberal.
Yeah.
He was unbelievably liberal.
But
he wrote a book called A Case of Need about how important it was to have legal abortions in the United States. Okay? This guy is not Sean Hannity, but he was a very devout scientist.
Well, the point back to being, it's not about consensus and what, it should be, science should be about questioning all the time and challenging it. And if people are too afraid to refute it and you got to cancel somebody, then I think that's a telltale sign that they're hiding.
When Einstein came up with the theory of relativity, he said it can't be true because it wasn't the consensus, and he backed down on the theory. He knew deep down his math and his theory was correct, and he put a fudge factor in to explain the numbers so that he didn't have to promote it. Eventually, he just said, this is stupid. He promoted it. He won the Nobel Prize, and he's, unquestionably one of the most brilliant people that have ever lived. And so I agree. Consensus is nonsense. Consensus is 100% politics. That's what you try to do. You try to reach a consensus. The science is settled. As soon as you say that, that's an anti-science thing you're saying.
Exactly.
Science is never settled.
Well, let's check out, I want you guys to check out Dr. Paul's, as he goes by, YouTube, his website, and his books. So I'm going to link them in the show notes. Remember to sign up for his newsletters as well, drpaulapproved.com or Dr. Paul MD, and I'll link his other pages on there. Check out his work. It was really impressive, and I'm sure you'll be sharing this episode with some people. Remember, this is our guest's opinion, not our own. We're not telling you to not vaccinate your children at all. We want you to just listen to this episode and think and use your judgment, what's best for your health care and your children with your own trusted physician. And on that note, we'll see you next time.
It's no secret that medicine is a bit uptight. That's why Tim and I created BS Free MD, to mix things up a little and have fun in the process. Besides, we are having these exact same discussions all the time, so we thought we might as well invite everyone to the party. If you really like us, you can get plenty more and maybe see one of Tim's cool tattoos on our Instagram or Facebook pages at BS Free MD. See you next time.
Well, we try to keep BS Free MD as raw and real as possible. We can't be held responsible for any medical decisions or discussions had as a result of what you've heard on the show. We know, bummer. But the truth is, we really do care about your questions. So feel free to reach out to us by email at doc@bsfreemd.com.